The midday sun over Camp Lemonnier, Djibouti, was unforgiving, baking the sprawling military complex into a shimmering mirage of dust, diesel fumes, and heated asphalt. The temperature was pushing 115 in the shade. For Lieutenant Commander Sadie Jarrett, the heat was the least of her concerns. She was exhausted down to the marrow of her bones. For the past 21 days, she had operated entirely off the grid in the Shabelle River Valley of Somalia, sleeping in the dirt, drinking purified swamp water, and providing lethal overwatch for a pinned-down element of Marine raiders. As one of the first women to successfully integrate into and command a Tier 1 DevGru element, SEAL Team 6, Sadie didn't wear her rank on her sleeve. Right now she wasn't wearing rank at all. She trudged across the gravel courtyard outside the Joint Operations Command Center, looking more like a battered insurgent than a decorated naval officer. Her faded Crye precision pants, sweat-stained olive drab T-shirt, and heavily modified plate carrier were caked in layers of dried African mud and dried blood. Some of that blood was hers. Most of it belonged to the Al-Shabaab fighters who had tried to flank the Marines she was protecting. Her face was smeared with dirt and camouflage paint, her blonde hair matted, tied back in a practical knot. Slung across her chest was her primary weapon, a heavily battered HK-4 Mastine, silenced and scarred from relentless use. She just wanted a shower, a hot meal, and 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep. Major Roman Harrison had other plans. Harrison was a logistics officer, a man whose uniform was perfectly pressed and whose combat boots were polished to a mirror shine. He was a garrison soldier, 15 years in, who had spent his entire career deftly avoiding combat deployments in favor of administrative power trips at forward operating bases. He thrived on regulations, uniform codes, and asserting dominance over anyone he deemed beneath him. To Harrison, the war wasn't won with bullets and strategy. It was won with tucked-in shirts, shaved faces, and absolute deference to his oak leaf collar brass. He was holding court outside the mess hall with two junior officers, Captain Miller and Lieutenant Davis, sipping iced coffee and complaining about civilian contractors when Sadie walked past. She didn't look up. She didn't salute. Tier 1 operators returning from black operations in unmarked gear didn't observe garrison pleasantries. Her ears were still ringing from a proximity mortar blast 3 days prior. "Hey, do you, in the filthy rig? Halt!" Sadie stopped. Her muscles burned in protest as she slowly turned around. Harrison was marching toward her, face flushed with indignation, his cronies trailing a few steps behind. He looked her up and down, lip curling in disgust. He saw a filthy, unidentifiable woman in non-regulation gear carrying a weapon without a chamber flag walking through his pristine base. He immediately assumed she was a low-level civilian contractor or a rogue private who had lost her mind. "Do you know how to salute an officer?" he snapped, stopping 2 feet in front of her. "Or did they not teach you that in whatever third-rate supply unit you crawled out of?" Sadie blinked her pale blue eyes, staring through a mask of dirt. "I'm returning from an operation, Major. I'm not in uniform. Excuse me." Her voice was raspy, dry as sandpaper. She turned to walk away. "I didn't dismiss you." Harrison stepped into her path. The courtyard went quiet. Passing sailors and soldiers stopped in their tracks. Captain Miller and Lieutenant Davis smirked, settling in for the show. Harrison loved dressing down subordinates in public. "Look at you." He gestured at her blood-stained plate carrier. "You're a disgrace to the United States military. What's your name and unit? I'm going to have your commanding officer chew you up and spit you out before the sun goes down." "My unit is classified, Major," Sadie said calmly, "and my chain of command doesn't intersect with yours. Step aside." Harrison's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. "Classified?" He looked back at his junior officers with a mocking grin. "Oh, we have a secret squirrel here, gentlemen." He turned back to her, voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I don't care if you think you're special forces or a contractor or the base janitor. On this base, We maintain standards, and right now, you are demonstrating none." He looked down at his perfectly polished boots. A thin layer of dust from the courtyard had settled on the black leather. He looked back up at Sadie, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You want to learn about standards? You're going to learn from the ground up." He raised his voice so the gathering crowd could hear every word. "You see the dust you just kicked onto my boots? You're going to clean it off. Get on your knees. Use a rag. Use your shirt. I don't care. But you aren't taking another step on this base until you show some respect for the rank." The silence in the courtyard was deafening. Captain Miller's smirk finally faded. Even for Harrison, this was an extreme power trip. Making a subordinate kneel in the dirt to clean his boots was a dangerous line. But Harrison was blinded by his own ego. He stood with his hands on his hips, waiting for her to break. Sadie looked at him. She studied his posture, his clean fingernails, the lack of calluses on his hands, the soft, unlined skin of his face. He was a tourist in a war zone. A rational officer in her position would have pulled out her military ID, flashed her rank, and watched him pale in horror as he realized he was attempting to haze a superior officer. She could have ended his career with a single phone call to JSOC. But Sadie was bone-tired. And somewhere deep in her exhausted mind, a dark, quiet humor took over. She knew something Harrison didn't. She knew exactly who was driving through the front gates of Camp Lemonnier at this very moment. Without a word, Sadie unclipped the retention strap of her rifle and let it hang at her side. She lowered herself slowly, her mud-caked knees hitting the gravel with a soft crunch. A collective gasp moved through the onlookers. A few enlisted men looked away in second-hand shame. Harrison swelled with pride, looking around the courtyard as though he had just won a major military victory. "That's right," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "Discipline starts with humility. Remember this moment." Sadie reached into a tactical pouch on her chest rig, her fingers wrapped in fingerless gloves, stiff with dried blood, and pulled out a small, frayed microfiber cloth she used to clean her sniper scope. She leaned forward and began to wipe the dust from the toe of his left boot. One swipe, two swipes, her face completely devoid of emotion. She was a statue executing a task with the same cold, mechanical precision she used when zeroing a rifle at a mile. "Put some elbow grease into it," Harrison snapped. "I want to see my reflection." "Yes, Major," Sadie whispered. She moved to his right boot. It was in that exact moment that the ground began to vibrate. It started as a low rhythmic hum, moving up through the soles of boots. Then came the unmistakable roar of heavy diesel engines. The crowd at the edge of the courtyard began to part. 4 heavily armored, joint-light tactical vehicles and 2 MRAPs rolled into the complex. They were covered in battle scars. The thick ballistic glass of the lead vehicle was spiderwebbed from bullet impacts. The armor plating scorched black in places from IED blasts. This wasn't a standard patrol returning. This was a unit that had just walked through hell and barely made it back. The vehicles ground to a halt, pneumatic brakes hissing. The heavy steel doors swung open, and the men of the 1st Marine Raider Battalion began to dismount. Nearly 100 of them across the convoy. These were Force Recon and MARSOC operators. Huge bearded men dripping with sweat, carrying heavy weapons, wearing the 1,000-yard stare of men who had been fighting for their lives for 3 straight weeks. At the head of the formation was Captain Mitchell Adams, broad-shouldered, uniform torn to shreds, a blood-soaked bandage wrapped tight around his left bicep. He barked an order, and the Marines began forming up in the courtyard for accountability checks. Then Adams turned around. His eyes locked onto the scene at the center of the courtyard. He went completely still. In the center of the gravel, surrounded by onlookers, stood Major Harrison. Chest puffed out, chin high. And kneeling at his feet, wiping his boots with a rag, was a blonde woman in a bloody plate carrier. Adams froze. The Marines behind him, noticing their commander's sudden halt, followed his gaze. One by one, the elite operators saw the woman kneeling in the dirt. The exhaustion evaporated from their faces, replaced instantly by something fierce and terrifying. The casual chatter died. The clatter of gear stopped. An eerie, absolute silence fell over 100 combat-hardened men. Captain Adams knew exactly who that woman was. Every man in his battalion knew who she was. For 3 weeks in the Chebelle River Valley, they had been trapped in a deadly ambush, pinned down by over 200 heavily armed insurgents out of food, low on ammunition, taking casualties. Their radio communications were jammed. They had believed they were going to die there. Then the insurgents' heads started exploding. One by one, the enemy commanders dropped. Machine gunners in the hills were neutralized by impossible shots fired from over a mile away. When the insurgents tried to flank the Marines at night, they were slaughtered in the dark by a phantom moving silently through the brush. For 7 days, that lone DevGru sniper, dropped in solo after her spotter was injured, had systematically dismantled the enemy force, providing the raiders the cover they needed to exfiltrate. Her call sign was Wraith. To the men of the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, she wasn't just an officer. She was a guardian angel. She was a legend. And now a rear echelon major was making her shine his boots. Captain Adams felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage burn through his veins. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply racked the bolt of his M4 with a loud metallic clack, slung it across his back, and began to march directly toward Major Harrison. Behind him, without a single order being given, 100 Marine Raiders stepped forward in unison. Their heavy boots hit the pavement like a thunderclap, a deep guttural rhythm that vibrated through the ground and rattled the teeth in your skull. Harrison initially smiled when he heard it. In his ego-driven mind, the returning raiders had witnessed his display of discipline and were marching over in admiration. He stood a little taller, adjusting his collar, ready to receive the approval of the grunts. Captain Miller and Lieutenant Davis were not so naive. They saw the expressions on those faces. They saw the way the men gripped their rifles. Miller took a slow, deliberate step backward, quietly distancing himself from the major. Adams closed the distance. The crowd of sailors and base personnel hastily pressed their backs against the concrete walls of the mess hall. No one wanted to be in the path of a Marine Raider detachment that looked ready to tear the compound apart with their bare hands. Harrison's smile faltered when Adams stopped less than 2 feet from him. Adams was 6'3", built like a freight train, and smelled of cordite, dried sweat, and copper. He didn't salute the major. He didn't even look at him. His bloodshot, exhausted eyes were fixed entirely on the mud-caked woman kneeling on the ground. "Captain Adams," Harrison barked, his voice cracking, "I didn't order your unit to form up here. Stand your men down and proceed to the armory. I am dealing with a disciplinary issue." Adams turned his head slowly. He looked at Harrison with a stare so utterly devoid of respect, so chillingly empty, that the major instinctively took a half step back. The air in the courtyard felt as though it had been vacuumed out of the space entirely. Behind Adams, a wall of 100 hardened operators stood frozen, their eyes boring into Harrison. The silence was suffocating. "You are dealing with a disciplinary issue," Adams repeated. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, ruined by 3 weeks of screaming over gunfire and helicopter rotors. "Yes," Harrison stammered, trying to project authority. This individual was walking through the base in non-regulation gear, brandishing a weapon, and refused to render a proper salute. I am teaching her a lesson in military standards." Adams looked back down at Sadie. She hadn't moved. She was still holding the dirty microfiber cloth, hand resting on the toe of Harrison's boot, her face a mask of absolute stoicism, simply waiting for the theater to play itself out. "Ma'am," Adams said softly. The word hit the courtyard like a detonation. Harrison blinked. "Captain, what did you just call her?" "Close your mouth, Major." Adams's voice cracked through the air like a razor. Miller and Davis physically flinched at the sudden force of it. "You will not speak another word until you are spoken to. Do you understand me?" In any other context, a captain speaking to a major this way would result in an immediate court-martial. But there was no protocol here. There was only the brutal, undeniable reality of the men who fought the wars and the men who hid from them. Adams reached down, extending a massive calloused hand toward Sadie. "Commander Jarrett," he said, his tone shifting to one of deep, unwavering reverence. "Please get up." Harrison's stomach plummeted. The color drained completely from his face. His eyes darted from Sadie to Adams and back again. Sadie looked at Adams's outstretched hand. She didn't take it. She didn't need help. With a slow, fluid motion, she rose from the gravel, her joints popping in protest. She dusted off the knees of her pants, clipped her HK-416 back onto her chest rig, and looked Harrison dead in the eye. "You wanted a reflection, Major," she said quietly, her pale blue eyes cutting through his rapidly crumbling facade. "I hope you like what you see." Harrison was hyperventilating. A lieutenant commander, a naval officer who outranked him, a woman who, based on her gear and the reaction of the most lethal Marines on the planet, was operating at a classification level he didn't even have clearance to read about. I didn't know," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Commander, I was unaware of your rank. You were out of uniform. I was simply enforcing—" "You were enforcing your ego." The new voice boomed from the steps of the Joint Operations Command Center. The crowd parted again. Striding down the concrete steps was General Davies Horton, commanding officer of Joint Special Operations Command in the Horn of Africa. 3 silver stars on his collar, a chest full of combat valor ribbons, flanked by 2 armed security detail members. He had been watching the entire exchange from the second-floor balcony. General on deck. Every person in the courtyard snapped to attention. Horton waved them down without breaking stride, walking straight toward the center of the standoff, eyes locked on Major Harrison. "General Horton, sir," Harrison stammered, throwing up a desperate salute. "I can explain." "Drop your hand, Roman," the general said coldly, "before I have someone break it." Harrison's arm fell slowly, hands visibly shaking. Horton stopped beside Sadie. He looked at the mud, the blood, and the utter exhaustion etched into her face. Then he looked at Harrison's shiny boots. "I've been watching you for 10 minutes, Major." His voice was quiet and precise, which somehow made it more dangerous than shouting. "I watched you stop an operator returning from a Tier 1 kinetic deployment. I watched you degrade her, and I watched you force a superior officer to kneel in the dirt to stroke your pathetic, garrison-bred ego." He stepped into Harrison's personal space. "She has no insignia because she doesn't exist on paper, you fool. While you were sitting in your air-conditioned office complaining about the supply chain, Lieutenant Commander Jarrett was alone, 50 miles behind enemy lines, keeping 200 Al-Shabaab fighters from overrunning Captain Adams' position. She has been awake for 72 hours. She has confirmed kills in the double digits on this deployment alone. She is the only reason these Marines are standing in this courtyard today instead of coming home in flag-draped transfer cases." The silence in the courtyard was absolute. You could hear the wind moving dust across the gravel. Harrison looked at the wall of Marines. He saw the tears of sheer exhaustion and suppressed rage welling in the eyes of those men. He looked at Sadie, who was staring past him, completely unfazed, simply waiting to be dismissed. The knife turned not from the general's words, but from the weight of his own insignificance. Harrison had built his entire career on the illusion of power. In 3 minutes, a silent woman covered in mud and dried blood had shattered it completely. "Major Harrison," General Horton's voice dropped to an icy calm, "as of this moment, you are relieved of your duties at Camp Lemonnier. You will surrender your sidearm and your security badge to the military police. You will be confined to your quarters until transport arrives tomorrow to fly you back to the States, where you will face an Article 15 hearing for conduct unbecoming an officer, insubordination, and hazing. General, please, your career is done. Now get out of my sight before I let Captain Adams and his men express their personal feelings on the matter." Harrison looked desperately for support from Miller and Davis. They had already vanished into the crowd. Trembling, stripped of every scrap of authority and dignity, Harrison turned and practically ran toward the barracks, his polished boots kicking up the very dust he had cared so much about. With Harrison gone, the anger in the courtyard evaporated. It was replaced by something deeper, heavier, a collective exhale that moved through 100 men at once. General Horton turned to Sadie. The hard, furious lines on his face softened. "Welcome back, Wraith," he said quietly, using her classified call sign. "We lost your transponder signal 2 days ago. We feared the worst." "The terrain was heavily jammed, sir," Sadie replied, her voice still raw. "I had to ditch the comms gear to move faster through the valley. The objective is complete. High-value targets are neutralized. Extraction corridor was secured." "I know." He nodded toward the Marines. "They gave us the sitrep on the radio. You did the impossible, Sadie. Again." He paused. "Go hit the showers. Medical wants to check that shrapnel wound on your shoulder. Then I want you asleep for a full 24 hours. That's a direct order." "Yes, sir." Sadie turned to leave. She just wanted the quiet of her rack. She took one step toward the Special Operations Compound. "Commander Jarrett." She stopped and turned. Captain Adams was standing at attention. He wasn't looking at her as a superior officer. He was looking at her the way men look at someone who dragged them back from the edge of death and asked for nothing in return. When the machine guns had pinned them down in that valley, it was her rifle that silenced them. When the mortars rained in, it was her laser designator that guided the strike. They had never seen her face out there. They only heard the suppressed crack of her weapon in the dark hills, followed by the enemy falling silent. Adams drew a slow breath. "Battalion." His voice echoed off every concrete wall on the base. "Present, arms." 100 right hands snapped to the brims of their covers and the edges of their helmets in perfect, razor-sharp unison. The crack of their hands hitting their uniforms rang out like a gunshot across the courtyard. These were Tier 1 operators. They bowed to no one. They feared nothing. But standing in the blistering African sun, holding their salute to the mud-covered woman before them, tears cut clean tracks through the dirt on their faces. In the front row, a young corporal with a heavy bandage wrapped around his neck was openly weeping as he held his salute. He had been dragged out of the kill zone while Sadie held an exposed ridge alone, providing his covering fire. He knew, in the way a man only knows the things that happen in the dark with the enemy closing in, that he was alive solely because she had refused to leave. General Horton, standing to the side, raised his hand and saluted her as well. The entire courtyard fell into it. Sailors, civilian contractors, supply clerks who had watched the confrontation with Harrison, none of them knowing the classified details. None of them needing to. The sight of 100 Marine raiders saluting a lone, unmarked woman told them everything they would ever need to know. Sadie stood frozen for a moment. The cold, mechanical detachment she required to do the things her country asked of her, the mental walls, the distance, cracked just slightly. A lump rose in her throat. Her pale blue eyes shimmered. She looked at Adams. She looked at the young corporal. She saw the blood on their uniforms. They were breathing. They were going home. She had done her job. Slowly fighting the exhaustion in every muscle of her arm, Sadie raised her right hand. Her fingers, stained with dirt and dried blood, touched the edge of her matted blonde hair. She held the salute for 3 long seconds. An unspoken conversation passed between the lone Navy SEAL and the 100 Marines. "I see you. You are my brothers. I would do it again." She dropped her hand. "Order, arms." 100 hands dropped in perfect synchronization. Sadie didn't say a word. She didn't need to give a speech. She simply turned, her rifle swinging gently at her hip, and began the long walk toward the Special Operations Barracks. The crowd parted silently to let her through, no one speaking, no one moving. until she disappeared behind the heavy steel doors of the classified compound. Back in his quarters, packing his bags in disgrace, Major Roman Harrison heard the echo of that command rolling across the base. He didn't know what they were saluting. He would never know. But as he sat on the edge of his cot and looked at his perfectly polished boots sitting by the door, the reflection staring back at him was that of a small, hollow man. He had spent 15 years demanding respect through rank and fear. Out in that courtyard, beneath the unforgiving Djibouti sun, he had watched real respect given freely, earned in the blood and dust of a valley he would never have the courage to enter, to a woman who would never once ask for it.